Hi, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webcast, Teaching Employees to Build Resilience. I'd like to thank our sponsor for today's webcast, Multi-Health Systems. A leader in developing the best psychological assessments for more than 30 years, MHS serves clients in corporate, government, military, clinical, educational, forensic, pharmaceutical, and research settings. MHS published the first commercially available assessment for emotional intelligence, a skill set which drives high performance in the workplace. The latest revision of this tool, the EQI 2.0, is used to identify critical determinants of workplace success, supporting and driving talent management initiatives. The MHS line of talent products specialize in emotional intelligence, change, influence, business simulations, entrepreneurship, risk tolerance, meeting facilitation, and more. This range of tools measure and manage talent and are ideal for use in coaching, organization and leadership development, selection, and succession planning. MHS also offers facilitation and custom training services if you are looking to bring one of these tools into your organization. Today, I also have the pleasure of introducing our presenter, Dr. Rumeet Billan. Dr. Billan is an award-winning, internationally recognized entrepreneur, learning architect, speaker, author, and humanitarian. Her mission is to raise potential by designing experience that builds resilience. She is the president and CEO of Viewpoint Leadership and an expert on psychological capital. She completed her PhD at the University of Toronto and has designed and facilitated programs, courses, and training sessions across industries and sectors. To learn more, please visit www.drrumeetbillan.com. And with that, Dr. Billan, I will turn this over to you.
Thank you so very much. And thank you to everyone who is attending this webinar. And thank you so much to Multi-Health Systems as the sponsor. It is such a privilege to work with Multi-Health Systems and to bring to you this webinar on building resilience. It is one of my most favorite topics to discuss. And really with this webinar, it's not just about speaking about what resilience is. It's also about talking about the strategies on how we can improve our overall resilience. We will have time at the end of our webinar for questions. So please feel free to ask your questions. We will, at the end, make sure we do have time to respond to them. I also wanted to share that you will get access to all of the slides. These will be made available to you. So if you do miss something on the slide, not to worry, you will get access to it. So getting right into it, the traditional definition of resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties and toughness. Now, within organizations today, it's actually not enough just to be able to recover quickly from the difficulties that we've faced. We're actually expected to learn from and grow from the challenges and setbacks. And that can be hard to do, especially when there's so much change happening. We are constantly being faced with different challenges, but it's also critical because this is how we move forward. Now, why is it that we are spending time today talking about this topic of resilience? We are spending time because life happens. I am pretty positive that everyone that's joining us today has experienced an obstacle or setback or a challenge in the past. And it's actually inevitable that in the future, we will also be faced with different challenges and setbacks. And there's also this notion of the changing landscape. So for example, there was a study that came out of Dell Technologies in November of 2017. And what this study says is that by the year 2030, 85% of jobs that will exist have not yet been invented. So if we think about that, how do we prepare ourselves for jobs and challenges that don't yet exist? And how do we prepare our students or our children for jobs and challenges that don't yet exist? And the simple answer is that we build our resilience. Now, in 2008, the term resilience, it actually skyrocketed in terms of the number of people that were Google searching it. And that was because of the 2008 market crash. Now, 11 years later, we're still focused on this term resilience, and that's because 11 years ago, we completely missed the boat. We missed the boat because we were so focused on how we build resilient organizations, when in fact, we should have been focused on how do we build resilient people within those organizations. And that's why 11 years later, we are still focused on the concept of resilience. Thank you so much to Eliza for that wonderful introduction. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. I did want to mention that I am an entrepreneur. I've been operating two businesses for over 15 years now. I design learning experiences that build resilience, and I am also a professor. So I taught at Humber College for 6 years, which is a college within the Greater Toronto Area, and I now teach at McMaster University. I write, I speak, I love what I do, and I'm going to be sharing some of my experiences from my travels abroad, as well as my experiences from teaching within our webinar today. So this is the framework that we are going to use. It's the PsyCap mindset, and PsyCap stands for psychological capital. At the core of psychological capital is resilience. So there are 5 different pieces that we are going to focus on today. We're going to start off with self-trust, get into objective reasoning, talk a little bit about possibility thinking, and then also how we can persevere, which leads to resilience. And this framework really helps us to develop our own psychological capital and also helps us to develop the psychological capital of others. So the first piece that we are going to speak about is self-trust. And when we think about self-trust, we connect this to things like self-confidence. And so I have worked with thousands and thousands of people. And across the board, it does not matter age, does not matter gender, does not matter position title. The number one thing that everyone wants to develop further is their self-confidence and their self-trust, how it is that they feel about themselves. So I want to illustrate this for you with a few examples. My first question to you, and please use your chat box to answer, is this, and just a yes or no. The first question is, how many of you believe that the opinions of others has an impact on how your peers, your colleagues, your friends perceive themselves? So how many of you would say yes? All right, thank you, Joyce, with a strong yes. I've got to strongly believe in this. Absolutely. Definitely. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you from everyone who's responding. Yes, yes. So I think it's fairly unanimous that we would agree that majority of us believe that the opinions of others has an impact on how our peers, colleagues, and friends perceive themselves. Okay, I'm going to ask another question, and my question is this. Do the opinions of others have an impact on how you perceive yourself? How many of you would say yes? I've got an at times, I've got a sometimes, I've got a lot of sometimes, depends on the person. So this is fascinating. It is so fascinating. And let me tell you why. It's actually quite easy for us to say that the opinions of others has an impact on how other people perceive themselves. And it's actually quite true that the opinions of others has an impact on how we perceive ourselves. So let me illustrate it in this way. If I were to give each one of you 100 pieces of feedback, and out of those 100 pieces of feedback, 98 pieces were positive, and 2, well, let's just say they were not so positive. What do we spend our time and energy on? Do we spend it on the 98 or do we spend it on the 2? The 2, the 2, the 2, the 2. So that's interesting. So I've just given each one of you 98% of positive feedback. And as Kelly says, it's negativity bias. That's exactly it, right? If I've given you 98% of positive feedback and 2% not so great, we still focus on the 2. And this has a huge impact on our self-confidence and our self-trust. Very important for us to note. So I led a huge study in Canada called The Tallest Poppy. And what we focused on, it was in partnership with Thomson Reuters and Women of Influence. And we focused on tall poppy syndrome. That term has been coined from Australia. And what that metaphor refers to is the fact that poppies are to grow together. And if one grows too tall, it gets cut down to size. So translate that into the workplace, what we were looking at is when people achieve, when they receive a promotion or success, are they being cut down to size? And the study actually focused on women in the workplace. We had over 1,500 women respond across industry, across sector. And what we found was that 87.3% had experienced tall poppy poppy syndrome. So they were attacked, they were resented, or they were ostracized for their achievements. And when we dug a little bit deeper into the study, we wanted to understand what was the impact on the organization and, more importantly, the impact on the individual. Well, from an organization's perspective, 70% of respondents said that it impacted their productivity. So organizations are actually not getting the best out of their top talent. And then 50% indicated they actually left the workplace. So what that means is that your top talent, your high performers, your high achievers are leaving your organizations, and they are actually more expensive to replace and harder to replace. And why does that matter? Why that matters is look at who's staying in these organizations, the cutters. We dug a little bit deeper. So we knew from our data that there was a huge impact on organizations. And I have to tell you, we had over 268 pages of data, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories. Now, on the individual, over 70% indicated that it impacted their self-confidence. Right? They engaged in negative self-talk. They experienced imposter syndrome. Why? Because of the opinions of others. It impacted how they viewed themselves. And there were many comments about stress, anxiety, mental health that came up. And there's a great question up here about men reacting to tall poppy syndrome. And we are going to save the questions to the end, but I do want to mention that men experience it too. We focused on women in the workplace for a number of reasons, and one of the reasons being that with the databases of our partners, we had 70% women in those databases. Men absolutely experience it as well, but differently. So what we found with women experiencing it, both men and women were cutting down women. It differed in terms of their roles. So we found that men in C-suite were more likely to do it, and women in peer or colleague or direct report roles were more likely to do it. With the anecdotal information, men actually experience it as well, but differently in terms of who's doing it and how they're doing it. What's critical about this study is that the opinions of others, the judgments of others, is what was impacting this. It was impacting their self-confidence. So we allow the opinions of others to impact our productivity, impact the fact that whether or not we are actually going to stay within an organization and whether or not organizations are getting the best out of their top talent. It has a pervasive impact. And for those that are asking about it, it is called tall poppy syndrome, and the white paper is available on tallestpoppy.ca. The study itself was called The Tallest Poppy, again in partnership with Thomson Reuters and Women of Influence. And it was really powerful for me to lead that study because I got to hear from the experiences of people in the workplace and how it was impacting their self-confidence and their self-trust. And so when we think about self-trust, right? We want to focus on things like the language that we use. So I want to share with you a few strategies. One of the strategies that we look at is the language. So Dr. Fred Luskin's research says we have approximately 60,000 thoughts every single day. And of those 60,000 thoughts, 90% are repetitive. So think about the thoughts that you are repeating to yourself every single day, and whether or not those thoughts are positive or not so positive, right? We also want to look at self-talk, because self-talk is how we make emotions real, right? So when we think about emotions, which are information and energy, how are we bringing those emotions to life, and how is that connected to our self-talk? So let me illustrate it for you with this example. And please do use the chat box. I love hearing from all of you, and thank you so much for the excellent engagement. So my question is this: a friend or a peer or a sibling or a partner, someone you really, really care about, they were experiencing something and they failed. And they're in tears, they're upset, and they come to you because they are seeking support. And so completely failed, they come to you for support. What might you say to them? Thank you, Beth Ann. You want to use some empathy. And what might you say to this person that's come to you that you really care about? Wonderful. You did your best. It'll be better next time. I'm sorry. Try it again. Let me know more. I believe in you. You tried your best. Don't be so hard on yourself. Failure is learning. Such a supportive audience. I love this. Thank you. This is fantastic. I bet you could do it. If you tried again, you did your best. Listen and then encourage. Love this. This is phenomenal. What did you learn from it? I'm going to let you keep bringing in, you got this. I love that one, you got this, because I have a 2.5-year-old son and I say that to him. I'm like, you got this, you got this. And then one day he turned around and he goes, Mom, I got this. And it felt really, really good. You should be proud of yourself. You worked hard. You did well. Amazing. Okay, here's my next question. Now, you don't need to use the chat box to answer this. What I'd like you to do is actually just think about this. So my next question is this. When you've failed at something, what do you say to yourself? And how many of us can admit that it is not as positive as what we say to those that we care about? So all that stuff that came up in the chat, how many of us can admit? Thank you, Deanna. It's much more harsh, right? So when we think about this, it's so powerful because my actual question, my real question in all of this is this one. If your friend spoke to you the way that you speak to yourself, would you be friends with that person? So I'm going to repeat that. If your friend spoke to you the way that you speak to yourself, would you be friends with that person? I've got about 98% saying no, 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 nope, of course not. Look at the chat box. To me, this is so fascinating because we spend time building up others, and that is important to do. We want to do that. So it's not to say we don't want to build up others. We absolutely want to do that. But why is it that we don't build up ourselves? Right? Kate says, I'd be divorced for sure. Right? Think about that. We build up others, but we don't build up ourselves. The most important relationship each one of us will ever have is the relationship that we have with ourselves. And when we think about the language that we use, and if it's not as positive, how is that impacting our self-trust? And as Paula is saying in the chat, we are our own worst critic. We absolutely are. And that brings me to the next piece, which speaks about our inner critic. So these are those disapproving thoughts or those feelings and behaviors that we have. You should have done this. And on these slides, I've posted actually a number of resources and studies because there have been a lot of studies around this. Now, each one of us has an inner critic, including myself. We all have an inner critic. And some inner critics are a little bit louder than other inner critics, right? And there are some studies that indicate as to why that might be. But this inner critic actually impacts our ability to be resilient. Why am I sharing this with you? Because there are consequences. So individuals who score high on self-criticism, they tend to have less friends and are less satisfied with social support. Number 2, which is at the core of resilience, they use more negative communication after a stressful event. So what does that mean? They go through that challenge, they go through that setback, or they go through that stressor, and they're using more negative communication. Well, if you go back to one of the first slides where we talked about the traditional definition of resilience, it's the ability to bounce back from the difficulties and toughness that we face. If we're using more negative communication after that stressful event or that challenge, it's going to take us longer to bounce back. But isn't that resilience? And so they also, the third piece, report lower levels of trust and share low amounts of information. And so how do we break that habit of becoming a critic and that self-critic piece? Well, we become the critic of our inner critic. We realistically challenge that negative communication. Right? Call something what it is, right? If it's horrible, if it's bad, call it what it is. It's what you say after that matters the most, right? So when we think about this, it's what you say after, and we want to minimize that negative communication, whether it's to ourselves or whether it's to our teams or whether it's to others. We want to minimize that because then we'll be able to bounce back even quicker than we would before. The next piece I'm going to speak about is objective reasoning. So you go through that challenge, you go through that obstacle, and are you looking at it for what it is? There's a wonderful quote by Dr. Chris Regis from the Harvard Business School, and he's a behavioral psychologist, and what he says is this: most people are unaware of the degree to which they're not trusting and open, and of the extent to which their conversations don't reflect what they actually think and feel. So I want to pose a question to the audience and to the attendees joining. Have any of you ever had a challenging conversation before? Just a yes or a no. I've got capital yes. Oh, I love that. Crucial conversations. I love crucial conversations. Lots of them, of course. Yes, we have challenging conversations, right? But do we look at those challenging conversations objectively, right? Or do we take that step back to what Dr. Chris Regis is saying? Do we take that step back and say, okay, am I being trusting and open? Is this conversation actually reflecting what it is that I think and feel? And that's really powerful, especially when we're looking at those challenges or those conversations or the things that we go through that aren't so great, and then understanding our intentions. What Dr. Chris Regis says is that we actually are not very effective observers of our own behavior. We judge our behavior, or we tend to judge others by their behavior, while the entire time we judge ourselves based on our intentions. What's fascinating about that is those people that we have challenging conversations with, they're doing the exact same thing. They're judging us based on our behavior, while the entire time they're judging themselves based on their intention. And how do we bring this back to objective reasoning? So are we looking at conversations or challenges objectively? Or are we judging based on a different barometer than what we're judging ourselves on? And this is really, really, really powerful, because when we think about objective reasoning, I'm not going to talk about positive thinking or negative thinking. It's actually about accurate thinking, looking at things as they are, but we get to understanding. And it's not about who's right or wrong or who's good or bad or positive or negative. It's about saying, okay, what past experiences have I had that's impacting how I'm viewing this situation or this conversation? And what past experiences has this person had that's impacting the way they're viewing this challenging conversation or this situation? And then also, when we look at those challenging states, it's also how we view those situations. Those who are optimistic tend to view challenges as temporary. Something happens, it's, oh, yep, okay, there's a challenge, we're going to get through this. Those who view challenging situations as permanent are less optimistic. So they may say something like, oh, yep, this is how it always is. This is how it's always going to be. And one of the strategies we use here is with the people that I work with, is we get them to do an inventory of the past 6 months to 2 years of obstacles and challenges that they were able to get through. And the reason we do this is because this becomes evidence for them that they were able to work through those obstacles and challenges, which relates to self-confidence, but also that those challenges were temporary and not permanent. And so we want to think about how is it that we're viewing challenging situations, and also how is it that we are confronting them, because that's going to impact our resilience. So looking at them as temporary versus permanent. And the truth is, we've all gotten through obstacles, challenges, and setbacks, and they were temporary. It's about shifting our mindset when we do so. I love this quote by Stephen Covey. We see the world not as it is, but as we are. So no two people interpret the exact same experience in the exact same way. The reason is because no two people have gone through the same past lived experiences, right? There's a wonderful book out there by David Brooks called The Social Animal. And in his book, he quotes Timothy D. Wilson's Strangers to Ourselves. And what Wilson says is this: at any given moment, each one of us can take in up to 11 million bits of information. And conservatively, each one of us takes in 40 out of 11 million bits of information. And what happens is we actually rely on our past experiences and our mental models in order to fill in the blanks. But how many times do we take a step back and ask ourselves, could I be wrong? Could I be wrong in how I'm viewing this challenge, this situation, or this person? Let me illustrate that for you with an example. I traveled abroad. I've done a lot of school building initiatives in different parts of the world, and I work with very rural communities. When I was in rural Africa, I was often referred to as a white male. Now, if you saw the picture of me in the wonderful introduction done by Eliza, you will see that to all of you, I likely don't look like a white male. Now, in that context, many people had not seen someone of my skin color, my body language, my mannerisms, right? The way I dress, different. And the only word they had to describe me in that context was white male. What's fascinating about this is I actually don't need to travel abroad to be referred to as a male. When I first started teaching, and for 6 years, my leadership students, every semester, they would come in, and on the first day of class, I would always ask them the exact same question. And my question was, those who don't know me, never took a class with me, how many of you thought that I'd be a male? And they laugh and they giggle, and 90% of their hands go up. Yes, miss. Sorry, miss. How'd you know, miss? And I always ask them why. And I get the same response, miss, because of your name. So when they get their schedules, they don't get Mr. or Miss, they get Professor Rumeet Billan, and my name is gender neutral. But let's think about that. 90% of them, every semester, every class, make an assumption based on the limited information that they have. And I share these stories with you because you and I do this all the time. We have limited information about a person or a situation, and we make judgments and assumptions about it. It's human nature. We're trying to make understanding. But how many times do we take that step back and ask ourselves, could I be wrong? Am I looking at this objectively? What information is missing, and how can I approach this in a way where I know this challenge is temporary? And that is objective reasoning. The next piece I'm going to speak about is possibility thinking. So you go through that challenge, you go through that stressor. Well, how do we come up with solutions in order to move past it? So there's this wonderful long-term study that was done by Charles Sinder. And what this study showed is that there was one trait that was directly related to academic success. And what that trait is simply hope. Now, how does Charles Sinder define hope? He looks at it in 3 different ways. The first piece is the ability to articulate goals and or solutions, right? So they're clear, they're meaningful. These are our goals. These are the solutions that we're going to use in order to move through this challenge. Number 2 is willpower. So that motivation to want to accomplish that goal or to get through that solution, that commitment piece. And the third one is way power, the ability to develop strategies in order to move through it. So how do we do that? How do we develop strategies in order to get through the challenges and setbacks that we face? One of the things that we're going to look at and explore right now is, again, the language that we use, but also how we frame problems. So the other course that I taught was social entrepreneurship. And about a couple of weeks into my course, my students would come in, they would sit down, and I would put up this slide for them. And I would say, okay, can you drive a car in a zone? 99% of them right away. No, miss, he can't. No, miss, he can't. Nope, no, miss, he can't. And that's it. Nobody asks me why I put up this slide. And I actually don't mention it again until right before break. Now, right before break, I put them into groups of 4 or 5, and I say, okay, you've got 5 minutes. I'm going to put up a question on the board or on the slides. You're going to brainstorm with your group for 5 minutes. We'll do group share, and then we'll go and break. And they're excited. Yes, tell us what it is. And I put up this slide. And I say, okay, how can he drive a car in his own? And they take 5 minutes, and they go on and do that. And the answers that they come up with are phenomenal, right? So from self-driving this, Google that, automation this, amazing. Some groups come up with three or four solutions, actual solutions on how this young man can drive a car on his own. Now, the reason I want to share these examples with you is because of this. These are the exact same people that 45 minutes prior, every semester, exact same people that said no, he couldn't. And 45 minutes later, the exact same people are coming up with solutions on how he could. Now, what happened in those 45 minutes? I can tell you, nothing in my lecture would have helped them. All I did was this. All I did was put the word how in front of the question. So you see, when we ask ourselves, can I do this? Can she do this? Can they do this? It's binary. It's yes, no, we move on. The second we put the word how in front of the question, we become solution focused. Our brain automatically starts looking for solutions in order to help us get through that challenge, setback, or to get to that goal. So the question is never, can I do this? The question is always how? How can I do this? Or if we're facing that challenge as a team, it's never can I, can they, can we? It's how can we? We become solution focused, and it allows us actually to live in possibilities. And that's how we engage with possibility thinking. I don't know who said this quote, but I absolutely love it. To have goals is to have hope. Now, the next piece I'm going to speak to you about is perseverance. Now, I'm sure many of us have created New Year's resolutions before, and you might say to me, well, Rumeet, I used hope theory. I was very committed to my goal. I was able to clearly articulate it. I was motivated to accomplish it. I even came up with strategies. I was going to go to the gym 3 times a week. And so I engaged with hope theory, but what happened? And oftentimes we find, especially with New Year's resolutions, about 3 weeks later, we stop doing it. Right? So the one piece that I think that is missing and critical is perseverance. Now, the reason why we stop at about 3 weeks later is because life happens. How many of you that are joining us today are either too busy, too tired, and or too stressed? Right? How many of you too busy, too tired, too stressed? I have a me, I have a yes. All of the above. Yes, yep, all of the above. Hard battle, I agree. Yes, 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 all 3. Thank you, Mark, for the enthusiasm. I feel the same. Overextended, absolutely. And then some, right, Wayne? And so when we think about that, life happens. So 3 weeks later, you know what happened? We got too tired, too busy, and too stressed. So we stopped going to the gym, or we stopped eating healthy, or we stopped working towards that goal because life happens. So how do we persevere? Well, let's think about that. How many of us actually develop contingency plans for when life is going to happen? We know we're going to get too tired, too busy, or too stressed. So do we have a plan B? Do we have a contingency plan? And by the way, that contingency plan, it could just be, I'm going to give myself time to breathe. I'm going to give myself a week off from working towards that goal. But we're actually articulating and we're actually putting in a plan to say, okay, I will give myself time off, but then go back to it. Daniel Craig, who's eating the last Girl Scout cookie, can I have some? I love Girl Scout cookies. But that's actually an interesting point, as we're going to talk about what happens when we're too busy, too tired, and too stressed, and look at those stress management tools. So thank you for adding that. Life happens. Okay, so having that option B, that plan B, that contingency plan can help us to expect those detours, because we are going to get too tired and too stressed and too busy. And this requires us to develop different pathways to potential solutions, but it also necessitates us to be flexible. If you go back to the stat that I said earlier, 85% of jobs that will exist by 2030 have not yet been invented. Well, flexibility is going to be a necessity. We are going to have to adapt. But how do we do that in a way where we feel like we are safe and in control, especially with change that we can't control? So I heard a wonderful speaker. I was in the States in New York, and I heard a wonderful speaker by the name of Jason Silva. He's got a program on National Geographic about the brain, and he talks about developing our flexibility muscle. And what he says is this: challenge your basic routines. So, for example, change the route that you take to work, or change where you get your coffee or tea from. Or instead of having spaghetti on Thursdays, try something different. And what he's getting at is this: we are so used to doing things in a certain way that we engage with automaticity. Our senses are actually not heightened. By changing these simple things that are within our control, where we feel comfortable and we feel safe, we start flexing that flexibility muscle. We start getting to be aware of what it feels like to be flexible. And so Jason Silva talks about this idea of developing our flexibility muscle. And so for us, it's challenging those basic routines, and that can get us comfortable with flexibility. So I loved his talk. And again, I was in New York. So the next morning I was like, yes, I need to be more flexible. So instead of going straight into walking to Central Park, I ended up making a right-hand turn. And what ended up happening as I made that right-hand turn is I ended up being in the audience of the Today Show watching Mariah Carey perform live. Had no idea she was in town, had no idea where the Today Show was. It simply happened by making a right-hand turn, and my senses were heightened. And I loved this. I thought this was phenomenal. This was like a bucket list item. I was in tears. It was beautiful. I came back to Toronto, which is where I'm from, and in Canada, and I changed my route to work, and I ended up getting a speeding ticket. So what's interesting about that, it doesn't always turn into a story about being in the audience of the Today Show watching Mariah Carey perform live, but it's this idea of being intentional about challenging our basic routines so that we become comfortable with flexibility. And when we think about this idea of flexibility, it is so, so important. So when I first started teaching, I was so excited. I spent hours building my PowerPoint. I went into class, and then all of a sudden, I noticed that my students were on their phones. And I actually got upset about this, and I made a comment. And at the end of the class, my students showed me their phones, and they said, "Miss, I was taking notes." Which is so very different from how I learn. I learn using pen and paper. To date, I still purchase actual books, but that's not how the generation coming into my classroom learns. And so if I care about their learning, if I care about engagement and their bringing technology in the classroom, I should be flexible. The attention span of millennials is that of 12 seconds. Gen Z, the ones that are in our higher education institutions right now, they're coming into our organizations right now, is that of 8 seconds. And to put that into context, that is less than a goldfish. And there are many different things that are vying for their attentions, including their mobile phones. And so if I think about that and I truly care about engagement, I need to be flexible. I can't expect them to just bring pen and paper into the classroom. If they're bringing technology, then I'm going to want to learn it too. And it's not to say that we need to change everything that we do to accommodate. It's about understanding preferences, right? So this is the first time ever within organizations. We've got four generations working within one organization at the exact same time. And we all learn and communicate differently across generations. And the goal here is not that we need to completely change the way that we communicate. It's about understanding preferences and being flexible and adaptable at times when it's needed. And that really, really is critical to perseverance. The next piece is stress management. Some of us eat Girl Guide cookies or Girl Scout cookies. Some of us may engage in stress eating, or we burn out. And so when we think about this in the workplace, long gone are the days where we work 9 to 5s. We don't work a 9 to 5. Today, the average worker checks their work email at about 7:42 a.m., gets to the office at 8:18 a.m., and leaves at 7:19 p.m. Now, that does not account for when they're doing work at home or checking emails. And so when we think about this in terms of stress management, majority of our waking hours are spent at work. How much of that is contributing to our overall stress? And are we taking time to recover? So for example, how many of us actually take our lunch break? That lunch break or those 15-minute breaks, that's time that we need to recover, right? Also, the commutes in the big cities, sometimes commuting is a stress, right? And so when we think about the idea of stress management, I don't have one strategy that's going to fit all. So for example, a lot of people speak about mindfulness and meditation. I believe in it. I think it's powerful. I've heard the best speakers talk about it. Apparently you only need 8 minutes. And again, I love the concept. But with a toddler, if I get 8 minutes in the day, I'm going to go take a shower. In my context, it does not work for me. However, it might work for me a couple years down the road, and I share this with you because there isn't one strategy that fits all. It's what works best for you in your context. But the key here is whether or not you take time to recover. So although I might not have one strategy, I do have one wonderful analogy. And the analogy is that of an athlete. So when an athlete is going to go play a sport or go run a marathon, they've got certain strategies in place. So they do a meal plan, they do specific stretches. And the reason they do this is because they know they're putting stress on their body. And by taking that ice bath or those meal plans, it's going to help their body to recover quickly. Now, whether you're an athlete or not, we put stress on our body every single day, all day long. Whether it's through commuting, whether it's that one person in our workplace that really puts us in a negative emotional state, the question becomes, do we take time to recover? Whether that's 5 minutes, whether that's 8 minutes, whether that's 10 minutes, whether it's shutting our door to take our lunch break, right? Or if we have open door policy, it's shutting that door for 1 hour to make sure that we get our work done. Because if we don't take the time to recover, that's what's going to lead to resentment and also burnout. And we don't want to get there. It's about putting boundaries on things like our technology, right? Shutting our phone off, not being accessible all the time. But again, it's what works best for you. But the key here is ensuring that we take time to recover. It's not stress that kills us. It is our reaction to it. And so when we think about this, we might not be able to control the stressor, but we can control our reaction to it. It goes back to what we viewed or what we spoke about earlier in relation to how we view challenging situations. It looks at whether or not we take time to recover. All of these things play a huge role in how we react to stress. The last piece that I'm going to circle back to is resilience, and then we're going to open up the floor to questions. So if you take nothing from this webinar, the one thing that I do hope that you take is simply this. It's what you say after that matters the most. When you go through that challenge or that setback, again, call it what it is. That was terrible. That was bad. That was horrible. Right? What you say after that point, it's what's going to matter the most. So that was bad. This is how I'm going to fix it. Or that was horrible. This is what I'm going to do differently next time. Or that was terrible, right? This is how I'm going to approach it differently. It's what you say after you call it what it is that's going to determine how quickly you bounce back and recover, and more importantly, learn and grow from the challenges and setbacks that you face. Resiliency is one's capacity to cope successfully in the face of significant change, adversity, risk, or even increased responsibility. Resilient individuals can actually thrive and grow through setbacks and difficulties. When faced with hardship, resilience bounce back to higher levels of performance than before, and they find meaning and value in the process. And we all have the ability to do so by focusing on our self-confidence and the language that we use with ourselves, by looking at things objectively, right? We see the world not as it is, but as we are. By engaging with possibility, it's not can we do this, it's how can we do this, and persevering with a plan B and being flexible and ensuring that we're managing our stress along the way. We can all be resilient. And that's what psychological capital is. We all have traditional economic capital, so your finances, your assets. We all have human capital, so this is your education and your experiences. And we have social capital, your community, your network. But how many of us have positive psychological capital? Knowing who we are, not based on the opinions of others and the judgments of others. And when we think about this, we grew up being asked that question of what do you want to be when you grow up? We ask this to students and children, what do you want to be when you grow up? But that question is irrelevant, especially since we know that jobs that will exist even 10 years from now aren't going to that they haven't even been invented. When I was younger, I couldn't say when I grow up, I want to be a web developer. There literally was no web. And Apple was just a fruit. It wasn't this massive company. And so when we think about this, that question about what is irrelevant, instead, it's about who. So I work with grade 7s and 8s, and we talk about this. We talk about who they want to be, the type of person. And I've just put up a few notes here. I have over 2,000 responses, right? I'm not going to read them all, but, the reason some people change. Someone who is not afraid of doing good. Someone who is very confident. I want to be able to make others believe in themselves that they can accomplish anything. And I love the last one. I want to be myself. Everyone deserves to be themselves. And how many times do we lose who it is that we are because we're trying to meet the expectations of someone else or because of the opinions of someone else? And so when we think about this, it's critical to resilience, remembering who it is that we are. As Joseph Campbell says, the privilege of a lifetime is being who you are, knowing who you are, and also engaging with positive self-talk and looking at things from possibilities. I worked with an 8-year-old boy, or I was speaking with him, and he says, I want to be a police officer. And I say, that's great. Why do you want to be a police officer? And he says, because I want to save lives. Well, if we start from there, that he is someone who wants to save lives, he actually opens up the door to possibilities. He can save lives by, yes, becoming a police officer or a doctor or a nurse or a teacher or a counselor or a therapist, and I can go on and on and on. The question is not what, but instead it is who. The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. So again, I want to say thank you so much to Multi-Health Systems for sponsoring this webinar and to ATD for hosting this webinar. It has been so fantastic to engage with all of you that are joining. And I noticed that some of you are joining on your lunch break. So thank you for that. And I'm glad that you are taking a lunch break and hope you had the opportunity to eat. Again, you will have access to the slides, but I do want to open up the floor to any questions that you might have. And I also want to mention that there is a wonderful assessment tool, the HRG from Multi-Health Systems, for those who want to see where they fall on the scale of resilience. So thank you so much to all the participants and the attendees for joining. And we are going to open up the floor to questions.
Thank you so much for a really wonderful presentation on a really important topic. We do have a number of questions that have come in through the chat. I will try to get to as many of them as I can in the time that we have remaining. One person asked, how can organizations help individuals stay organized and informed when changes are happening? For instance, we have a lot of technical rollouts and upgrades happening this year. IT sends emails, as does the training team, and messages get lost in the shuffle. How can we help foster resiliency on all sides?
Excellent question. And a lot of that falls onto communication and understanding that different generations communicate very differently. So we can send all the emails that we want, but Gen Z, who is coming into our workplaces right now, they don't do email. That's not how they communicate. So you actually might be missing out on an entire generation by communicating just via email. But whether you're Gen Z or a Gen X or a millennial, it doesn't matter. Our inboxes are full. Right? They're constantly full. We might be deleting. This isn't important. This isn't priority right now. And so looking at different ways that we can communicate. Many of us likely Google things, right? So we're Googling questions. some generations don't. They YouTube things, and that's how they're receiving information in video format. Even when we look at things like learning and development, there's this rise of micro learning because that's how we retain information. And so, to the question, I think having a very effective communication plan that spans across different channels is going to be critical, especially with rollouts, because that way we can gain more understanding and also ask if there are any questions and be transparent, which all falls in line with what it is that we want to do.
Great, thank you. And someone else wrote in saying, I practice mindfulness, but I am not a naturally optimistic person. What are some ways I can train my brain for optimism so I can move beyond obstacles and ask myself how?
Wonderful. And so mindfulness really focuses on being present in the present moment. And when we think about optimism, optimism is looking at kind of the future state, the outlook that we have on the future. So a little bit different in terms of mindfulness. But with optimism, the strategy that we use is actually looking at the past. And so looking at the challenges and obstacles that we were able to get through, because it shifts our mindset from viewing challenges as permanent and shifting it to temporary. That has been one of the most effective strategies that I have come across.
Wonderful. And someone else wrote in asking, is it possible to become too resilient to the point where it becomes overconfident?
Oh, great question. Overconfidence, it's how it's viewed. As long as you're able to bounce back and get through those challenges, I don't think it matters if other people view it as overconfident or not. As long as it's not, I think there's a fine line between being confident and being arrogant. And so if we're talking about arrogance, that's something very different. But if you're confident that, there's this challenge, but we got this, I think that's powerful. And if someone sees it as overconfidence, I wouldn't pay attention to that.
That's a great perspective. Thank you. And someone else wrote in, and I think this is a really interesting question. How would you recommend being truly who we are when the work environment dictates a specific persona?
Oh, that's a great question. And I mean, is your work aligned with what it is that you want to do and who it is that you are? If it's not, that's what we call emotional tax. If you are showing up every day not being who you are, that is having an impact on you and an emotional tax on you, especially if we don't feel comfortable being who it is that we are. And so in those scenarios, it's kind of critical to take that step back and say, okay, is this aligned with who I am? What impact is this having on me from a stress perspective? And also really simply an alignment perspective. And is that how I want to show up? So yes, in the workplace, I mean, we definitely act differently when we're at home than when we are at work. But if we are trying to be a completely different persona, I think some reflection on whether or not it's worth it is required in that scenario.
Thank you. And there's another question, someone saying, how do you handle a senior leader who uses resilience as a weapon, for example, not promoting people or criticizing people who are not resilient?
Oh gosh, that's just, in my opinion, a horrible leader. That's just not positive. That is not getting the best out of your employees. And the leader may actually see a short-term benefit from that, but we know, and the data shows there is not a long-term benefit to that. And it's going to impact productivity. And so leadership needs to get on board with this idea of cutting down people, because that to me is cutting down people. That's not positive. That is not going to get the best out of them. And the employees are likely looking for jobs elsewhere. And it's going to cost the leader money to replace them. And it's impacting productivity, creating a culture of distrust. And it's just not an environment many people will put up with anymore these days, is what I'm learning. So it's just not good leadership. Simply put, they might see it as effective, but it's likely only going to be effective if it is in the short term and not long term.
Absolutely. And a somewhat related question, so I don't know if you'll have anything to add on to this, but someone else had asked, what if leadership is a little uncomfortable with transparency?
I would wonder why. And I think in today's world, you can't be comfortable with transparency anymore. We can Google things, we can find out things. And the millennials and Gen Z, they want authenticity and transparency. We would actually prefer a leader who has failed but can admit it versus someone who is pretending to be perfect and is hiding things. You are more likely to gain trust by being transparent, even if that means putting out the things that we failed at. But what's interesting as a society, though, oftentimes I ask people, what makes a great leader? And one of the responses that I get oftentimes is someone who is able to learn from their failure, which I think is fantastic. But the question then becomes for all of us is, do we allow people to fail? Do we allow leaders to fail? And a part of it is if we don't, which majority of the time that is the case, leaders might be uncomfortable with transparency because the environment isn't such that it allows them to be transparent. Right? So I would really look at the deep issue around why they're not being transparent. Is it a cultural thing? Is it something that they have something to hide? What's going on in that space? And then go from there.
Those are all wonderful points. Another person had written to ask, how does a resilience scale differ from flexibility on, say, the EQI 2.0?
A wonderful question. And I mean, the EQI 2.0 has a number of scales that connect to resilience. We could talk about self-regard. We could talk about problem solving. We could talk about stress management. We could talk about flexibility, as the question points out. And so with the HRG, we look at the 3 C's: commitment. We look at all the 3 C's, which is very, very critical to building resilience. And so challenge, commitment, and collaboration. And so when we look at these 3 C's, we want to see where we fall on them, and then look at how that differs. And the 3rd C, apologies, not collaboration, it is control. Whether or not we feel that we are in control of the change or what that setback is. I got a little too excited there.
No, that's great. Thank you for clarifying. That's very helpful. And then one more question. Someone had written, what if the situation that you're asked to do, such as being given too much additional responsibility, goes beyond resilience? Does the resilience then become the difficult conversation and saying no?
Wonderful. And sometimes we have to say no, but it's when we have those conversations, and it comes from crucial conversations, is making sure we start with facts, right? And making sure we start with facts, we share our intention, and then open it up to dialogue. We've all had challenging conversations before, but it's how we approach them that can make them a lot less challenging. And it's more so about being open to understanding.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I know that you mentioned a few resources in the course of the webinar, but someone did write in if you have any suggested resources on the topic of resiliency, any books, articles from an evidence-based source that you would particularly recommend.
Absolutely. Please check out the Multi-Health Systems website. Lots of wonderful resources there around resilience. If you're looking, I know there were a few points about the tall poppy. There are definitely training and development opportunities with tall poppy syndrome and how we can manage that and create an ecosystem where both men and women can thrive in the workplace, and that's tallestpoppy.ca. There's different workshops and training opportunities, again, available on Multi-Health Systems as well as Viewpoint Leadership.
Great. Thank you so much. And we have time maybe for one more question. Someone had asked if you work with personnel who maybe whine to the boss and you make a decision, they're saying that an open door policy is preventing supervisors from doing their jobs effectively. Do you have any advice for a situation like that one?
I get that way too often, where I have people that are saying, I have an open door policy, but I can't get my work done, and I'm stressed because I can't get my work done. And so in situations like that, I kind of say, well, what happens if you shut your door? Well, if I shut my door, then it's not an open door policy. Well, what happens if you shut your door for 1 hour out of the day, right? Or 1 or 2 hours out of the week. And so it's putting boundaries on open door policies. And that's what I think is critical, because at the end of the day, you still need to get your work done. But you also want to make sure people believe that you have an open door policy, which is fantastic as well. It's finding the balance between both. And so your open door policy might be in the afternoons or in the mornings. It might be all day, but maybe you take that 1 hour during lunch. I had someone that I was working with, and what she did was she closed the door and she put a sign up and said, I am enjoying my lunch, so should you. Right? And so this idea of putting boundaries around open door policy, I think is critical, because we do have to get our work done.
That's a great message, and I think a good note to end on since we're at the top of the hour. But thank you so much for a really wonderful presentation and for answering all of the great questions that people chatted in. A really big thank you to MHS for sponsoring this webcast, and of course, thank you to everyone who tuned in today.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. It was such a pleasure.
All right. This was great. Thank you so much for your time. This actually concludes today's webcast. Thank you all for attending. The recording will be available at webcast.td.org. We will send all registrants an email tomorrow with this link. And please visit our event calendar to sign up for future webcasts.